Welcome to our Christmas special in 2021. We're recording this on Christmas Day, but we'll be posting it a little bit later in order not to ruin your Christmas, because what I'll be saying today will be quite critical of religion and especially of Christianity. Now, obviously, as we all know, the prime function of Christmas today is basically that it's a yearly ritual practice of consumerism and exercise in consumerism. And that's also especially intended to introduce children to it. But there is still, of course, also a religious sub-function, right? You take off a few days from your capitalist work routines and have a break. And then a certain dose of religion is offered to people as Karl Marx and others would have said, an opium for the people. So it's offered to, on the one hand, to keep those happy who are already addicted to the drug, but also maybe to recruit a few new ones. Today's video is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I will talk more generally about the metaphor religion as the people's opium. In the second part of the video, I will talk about how Marx in particular used this metaphor and talk about his critique of religion, which I think is very important for his whole thought, also in historical connection with Hegel and Ludwig Feuerbach. And then in the third and final part of the video, I will try to give a post-Marxist critique of contemporary civil religion. And I will suggest a slightly different metaphor in this context, and namely try out the people's cocaine rather than the people's opium. So part 1, the people's opium. The phrase the people's opium, Opium des Volkes in German, is commonly associated with Karl Marx. And indeed, Marx used the phrase, but he didn't invent it. It had been used by quite a few other people in the 18th and 19th century. In Germany, for instance, the political writer Heinrich Heine had used it, and in France, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and even the Marquis de Sade had used similar metaphors. Important about the phrase and in its different variations, I think, are 3 things. Number 1, religion here refers first and foremost to Christianity. So it's almost synonymous with Christianity. Then secondly, I think it has to be noted that opium was a kind of very fashionable drug in the first part of the 19th century. For instance, there was this rather popular book by Thomas de Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which was published in 1821. So this also represents how the drug was kind of consumed in the European bourgeoisie, for instance. Importantly, though, also is that when Marx used the phrase in the mid-1840s, this was exactly also the time of the Opium War or wars in China. So opium is not only associated with the bourgeoisie and the British bourgeoisie in particular, but also with imperialism and colonialism and capitalism. I want to suggest 7 interrelated meanings of the metaphor opium of the people for religion. First of all, opium has a delusional quality to it, and then thereby this is also ascribed to religion. This notion of religion as a delusion became popular quite recently through the book by Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. And it basically indicates something like a consistent false consciousness that counters empirical evidence. More precisely speaking, opium, maybe you have only hallucinations or illusions from time to time, whereas with religion, at least in Dawkins' understanding, you're basically trapped in a constant state of delusion. The second meaning of the metaphor, and that's very important, is that both opium and religion provide something like a false relief from suffering. So for instance, opium is a painkiller and it provides temporary relief from pain, but while providing relief, it also makes people addicted and thereby establishes a much larger form of suffering in return for the short time gain. It becomes a chronic and unhealthy habit. And the idea is that religion similarly can provide relief from short time suffering. For instance, you're going through a crisis, someone has died or something like this, but in return for entering the religious mode, you might become addicted and eventually see no way out of it anymore. A third meaning is false ecstasy or false entertainment, right? With drugs, like with religion, you can experience certain highs, moments of ecstasy, but at the same time, you still continue, so to speak, to live a low life. It doesn't change the conditions of your life, which might be miserable, but nevertheless provides you with a certain extreme high from time to time. Now, this leads to a fourth aspect, which might seem a little bit contradictory, but I don't think actually is not, namely that both opium and religion can also function and do function as a sedative. So opium not only provides you highs from time to time, but in general, it also makes you lazy, sleepy. So the metaphor also points to a similar function of religion, that religion makes you passively submit to certain dogmas, right? For instance, Kant in his famous essay on answer to the question, what is enlightenment, also points out to the fact that religion makes people adhere to dogmas so that they do not dare to think for themselves. So it makes them intellectually passive and lazy. Moreover, of course, both opium and religion then, as an extension of this intellectual laziness, also leads to something like a political laziness. You don't develop any form of revolutionary spirit. You accept the social hierarchies. Now, fifth, and I think this is important and this is normally not so much recognized, there is also, I think, a clear economic dimension to the metaphor, right? Drug addicts, opium buyers, not only become addicted to the drug, but they also become impoverished. The drug is expensive. So the drug consumption also establishes a distinction between the poor and the rich. The sellers of the drugs get rich while the buyers are kind of kept in constant poverty. And this does not only relate to the individual drug addict. It also relates, and again, looking here at the historical context of the Opium War in the 1840s, in this case, a whole country, namely China, was kept, so to speak, in poverty by being forced to purchase opium from the British, basically organized drug dealers, which at the same time made the British rich and the Chinese poor. So, and that's something that we can also see with, for instance, the Catholic Church, that it somehow economically thrives on a mass poverty. That was the case in the Middle Ages, where large parts of the population were really poor, but the church became substantially wealthy. And that is still very similar in countries like, for instance, the Philippines, or in certain areas in South America, where there's a certain endemic mass poverty that somehow at the same time sustains the church's wealth. Then sixth, there is an aspect of intolerance and aggression. The addict basically gets immune to any calls for abstinence. The addict gets aggressive when the drug habit is threatened. And similarly, if you're very religious or fundamentalist religious people tend to react aggressively whenever their faith or they feel that their faith is threatened. We see this famously already in the allegory of the cave, which is somehow also an allegory for Socrates' life and death experience. So when, let's say, the philosopher questions, in the case of the allegory, the phantoms that the people in the cave see, or in Socrates' case, when Socrates questions Athenian religion, the reaction to it is very aggressive. So the threat to a drug addict's habit, as well as the threat to a religious person's belief, can provoke aggression or even violence. For me, however, the most important dimension of meaning of the metaphor religion as the people's opium is a seventh form of meaning, and I want to explain three layers of it. The first of which is parasitic attachment to everyday life. So a drug addiction obviously overshadows every aspect of an addict's life, right? Family, friends, your job, your lifestyle. Everything is done in the service of the addiction. Everything you do is done somehow in order to sustain the addiction. And religion can function in a quite similar way. It can also take over literally every single aspect of a person's life. So in this sense, it can become totalitarian, totally define a person's identity. Let's just give a few examples. The experience of joy, right? Whatever. Enjoying simply a fine sunny day, or enjoying a nice meal, or whatever, scoring a goal in soccer. All these experiences for a religious person will be somehow related to God. You know, you have to thank God for the nice weather, you have to thank God for the nice meal, and you have to thank God for, giving you the opportunity to score that goal. Every experience of joy is related to God. And similarly, of course, a drug addict's experience of joy is typically related to the drug consumption. Secondly, think of love, sex, and relationship. For the religious person, all these experiences or aspects of their life are also understood and experienced in terms of religion. So let's say you love someone, your children or your parents, you love them somehow in God. As a good Christian, for instance, you marry a person who is also Christian, and you want to raise your children in a Christian way. Then, of course, very importantly, your sexual practices, your approach to sexuality is very much influenced by the prescriptions of the faith. And similarly then, for the drug addict's social and emotional experiences will also be strongly shaped by the drug consumption, and also his social life, the people he or she hangs out with, that will also be related to, let's say, the drug community that the person exists within. Then next element, daily habits, right? The religious person also orients their eating habits, even their style of clothing, the music they listen to. All these things are dominated by religious beliefs, if you are a very strong believer. And similar, of course, also, let's say, a drug addict's whole lifestyle, including eating habits and so forth, are strongly related to the drug consumption and the drug addiction. And then also the worldview, right? Obviously, religion very much shapes a person's aesthetics, a person's morality, a person's political views. They are all somehow aligned to the religious beliefs. You see this in fundamentalist religious countries like Iran, or let's say in the Bible Belt in the United States, where also all these correlations between politics and religion and morals and aesthetics are clearly present. Similarly, of course, a drug habit can also shape a person's perspective on a person's worldview. In this sense, religion does define a person's identity in a similar way as a drug habit does. When you invite religion or God into your home, then there's a risk that, like starting an opium consumption habit, it will eventually dominate your life totally. Your thinking, your feeling, your social life. Your whole personality and identity will be shaped by it. And I think precisely for this reason, a critique of religion is essential. And as I said in another video, I think that this is a prime function, a core function of philosophy, and it has been the function of philosophy for hundreds, if not thousands of years, both in the East and in the West. I already referred to Socrates, but you can also refer to Buddhism, and especially Zen Buddhism, and I will give two examples here from the Zen Buddhist tradition, where you can see a critique of religion from within religion. The first story is about the Zen master Mazu, who lived in the 8th century in China. The short story, which is collected in his collected sayings, goes like this. A student asked Mazu, "Why do you say that spirit and Buddha exist within one another?" And then Mazu said, "So that the little children stop crying." And then the monk asked further, "And what do you do once they have stopped crying?" And then Mazu replied, "Then I tell them that there is neither spirit nor Buddha." So I think what this little story says quite clearly is that, yes, religion, and in this case, the belief in Buddha and the Buddha spirit, can help the small children stop crying. It can be good from time to time, just like consumption of opium or other drugs may be nice from time to time. But really, the problem is once this becomes a constant habit. And so as a second step, once the children have stopped crying, it is equally essential or even more essential to, as Mazu says, to tell them that there is neither spirit nor Buddha. So to use Buddhist language, to cut the attachment to the belief. So the ability of dissociation is crucial to maintain this ability of dissociation. A second then story that I like even better is from the recorded sayings of another Zen Buddhist master called Wen-yi from the 10th century. And the story goes like this. Once there was a monk who lived in a small temple. On the door, he had written the character spirit. On the window, he had written the character spirit. On the wall, he had written the character spirit. The master said, "On the door, you should write the character door. On the window, you should write the character window. And on the wall, you should write the character wall." So I think this message is very similar to the one in the Mazu story, but it's even sharper. What Wen-yi is saying here is basically, don't allow religion to become some sort of master narrative so that you see everything in terms of it, and so that somehow your spirit is totally possessed by it. The word I translated with spirit here in Chinese is actually xin, which refers in a Buddhist context to the Buddha mind, the consciousness, the individual heart mind. But at the same time, it also has this religious connotation to it. This is why I chose here the translation of spirit. And again, the message by Wen-yi is very clear, I think. You just guard yourself against this totalitarianism of religion, of the religious worldview. Don't let it take over every single aspect of your house, of your reality, of your life. So in this sense, the metaphor religion as the people's opium can also mean be aware that both opium and religion can turn people into possessed and obsessed addicts, and that's dangerous. They can define a person's identity in a totalitarian way. So this brings us to the second part on Marx and Feuerbach and Hegel and critique of religion. So more specifically, Marx uses the metaphor religion as the people's opium in a famous quote, which I'll quote here, which is from his introduction to a text called Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, which was written in 1844, 1845. And the passage goes like this: religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. So what Marx points out here, summarizing it, is that, again, Christian religion provides some form of false relief from very real suffering, while sustaining the conditions that produce this very real suffering. Or in other words, religion at the same time expresses a desire for redemption from real suffering, and at the same time somehow in its very structures, in its very narratives, expresses very well the nature of that suffering, which is a sort of paradoxical thing. On the one hand, religious structures and religious belief are just a mirror image of suppressive conditions, but at the same time, these religious beliefs also very clearly express a desire of relief from these very modes of suffering. I do think that Marx's views on religion and his critique of religion are very central to his whole thinking and his whole political and philosophical outlook. And this is not only the case for Marx, but it's the case for the whole political and philosophical Enlightenment, which is the historical background for Marx's whole theory. And especially two strong influences on Marx highlight the importance of religion, namely Hegel and Feuerbach. Hegel's philosophy is very strongly grounded in Christianity and specifically in Protestantism. He went to the Tübinger Stift, a religious seminary. And then his whole philosophy, I think Hegel's whole philosophy, can be understood as some form of reaction against his religious education, as an Aufhebung, a sublation, a lifting of the religious outlook on the world. So Hegel very much describes the alienated state of spirit in the mode of Christian religion, where spirit is basically split into the this worldly human side and the otherworldly godly side. And for Hegel, the purpose of spirit is to overcome this alienation, to reunite the transcendent and the immanent. And this task is to be fulfilled by philosophy. So philosophy overcomes, is the dialectical next stage that Aufheben lifts religion and changes it into something different. And also at the same time, philosophy thereby, as Aufhebung, as lifting of religion, represents or is a more mature form of thinking and of being in the world and of existing. I think one way of describing this lifting of religion into philosophy is with the German word Versöhnung that Hegel uses quite frequently. Literally translated, it means something like reconciliation. The actual etymology of the word comes from the German word Sühne, or atonement. So it means somehow a reconciliation through atonement. However, the word is spelled in a different way with a different umlaut, namely the O umlaut, so that it also reads like literally translated sunization. Instead of the middle part of the word Söhn, can also be understood falsely as relating to the word Sohn for son. So if actually read in accordance with its spelling, the word can also refer to, and I think this is how Hegel uses it intentionally or not, to the self-sonization of God, right? God, through Jesus Christ, sends his own son to the world, human world, becomes human, and through his own sonization, this reconciliation between humankind and God, between the immanent and the transcendent, takes place. So this is also, I think, really what the phenomenology of spirit, or again, philosophy, is supposed to do. It is supposed to eliminate the alienation between humans and God, and this is done on the human side. So this is also a secularization, a humanization, a sonization of the divine. This becomes much more explicit and maybe simplified in the philosophy of one of Hegel's followers, Ludwig Feuerbach, and in his famous book, The Essence of Christianity, which was published in 1841, so also just a few years before Marx's famous quote that we just read was written. And the core idea of Feuerbach is that humans projected everything that is good and special about humans, about the human spirit, to a non-human ideal being, namely God. And especially three things: love, creativity, and intelligence, right? Humans are loving beings, they have affection, they are creative, and they are intelligent. And these essentially human characteristics are then projected to a non-human higher being, otherworldly being that humans invent. So similar to Hegel, Feuerbach thinks that in this way Christianity is good, but it is now time to understand that what Christianity is essentially about is not about a description of some otherworldly being, but what it expresses is actually a self-description of humans. So the point for Feuerbach is to acknowledge and celebrate that the presumable attributes of God, such as love, creativity, and intelligence, are actually not attributes of God, but are attributes of humans. So in order to realize the essence of Christianity, these ideas, we actually need to get rid of Christ, and we need to get rid of God. So we need to understand that these are just narrative images, that these are just signs, but not the essence or the meaning. And they're just images, but not the actual concept, to put it in Hegelian terms. Once we get the true concept, the true begriff of, for instance, love, creativity, and intelligence, then we make it completely our own. We understand by grasping it, by having the concept, by having the begriff, that these are our possessions, that they belong to us and not to something else. So again, it's about the reduction of the alienation through secularization. Now, Marx very clearly follows Hegel and Feuerbach, but again, he critically reacts to them. He wrote the famous 11 Theses on Feuerbach, again, mid-1840s, around 1845, and they were only published posthumously. And the core idea here is that Marx wants to transform Feuerbach's idealism into materialism. So for Marx, Christianity is not merely a projection of the human spirit, of human consciousness, of human thinking. But, and again, this is important, Christianity is basically some form of narrative reflection of the alienated state of actual human material existence, of the human way of life and human production. And it somehow reflects, as alluded to earlier, a state of material exploitation of humans by humans. So let's look at thesis number 4 of these 11 theses. And I'm going to read it here. So Marx writes, Feuerbach starts out from the fact of religious self-alienation, of the duplication of the world into a religious world and a secular one, as we discussed earlier. His work consists then, says Marx, in resolving the religious world into its secular basis, right? This complete secularization of the Christian ideas which lay bare the actual essence of the faith. But then Marx goes on, but that the secular basis detaches itself from itself and establishes itself as an independent realm in the clouds can only be explained by the cleavages and self-contradictions within this secular basis. So what Marx says here, this projection of certain human qualities to otherworldly power not only express certain human desires and so forth, but and certain human capacities. Very importantly, they also reflect what he calls here self-contradictions within this secular basis. They reflect the alienation of the faith respects an actual alienation in the real world. The latter, the secular basis, writes Marx, must therefore in itself be both understood in its contradiction and revolutionized in practice. So a critical analysis of religion must first understand how religion is kind of a metaphorical depiction of certain alienated structures in the actual life world. And secondly, we not only need to understand this, but a critique of religion must also try to change this very state of alienation, change the world. And he gives, importantly here, a very concrete example. Thus, for instance, after the earthly family is discovered to be the secret of the holy family, the former must then itself be destroyed in theory and in practice. So again, religion expresses contradictions and repressive and alienated structures in society. And importantly, Marx points here to the family structures, right? He talks about the Holy Family here, right? We have the Holy Mother, Virgin Mary, we have God the Father, we have Jesus the Son, and so forth. And for Marx, this kind of Holy Family represents the repressive structures, the patriarchal structures in actually existing families. So on the one hand, we must understand how the Holy Family basically is just an image of certain social pathologies that are established in the repressive family structure, which, for instance, represses women. And secondly, once we've understood this, we must not just, as Feuerbach suggested, somehow essentialize the great ideals employed in the story, but we must change the actual family structures. We must actually change the social structures. So importantly, Marx here ties Christian religion to what I like to call sincerity-based social structures, role-based structures. In this case, social structures based on family roles. So the idea is that for Marx, religion will disappear not through a change in thinking, not through a transition to some form of humanism as envisioned by Feuerbach, but by change in society. Once the patriarchal, repressive, alienated family structures are revolutionized, then the foundation for the religious meta-narrative will collapse. Once human exploitation ends, there will no longer be a need for symbolic descriptions and otherworldly salvation fantasies. So importantly, Marx doesn't want to abolish or eliminate religion. Marx says it will disappear by itself when society changes. And yet, of course, Marx here is not defending anything like religious freedom. For Marx, the notion of religious freedom would be a contradiction in terms. In a truly free society, there would be no religion. This leads us to the very famous Thesis 11, which goes like this: the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So in the context of the thesis on Feuerbach, this clearly also has a religious background and is related to the relation towards religion. So the point is not to switch from a Christian to a humanist narrative, as suggested by Feuerbach, but to replace, for instance, the patriarchal family structure, and thereby, by extension, also to replace capitalist exploitation with less repressive or non-repressive social and economic structures. A change in thinking will not initiate, but will only follow socioeconomic changes, not the other way around. So again, the point is not to simply eliminate or abolish religion, but to change the existing socio-political realities so that the traditional master narratives will collapse. So now the final part, a post-Marxist critique of civil religion, the people's cocaine. In this final part, I want to look at religion today, which, as I said in other videos, has very much become some form of civil religion, at least in the West. As I have also hinted at in other videos, I think today's left has somehow departed from Marx by no longer being that critical of religion and by having somehow forgotten the task to critique religion in its various forms. By saying this, I also want to add right away, like Marx, I'm not arguing in favor of any form of abolishment or elimination of religion or civil religion for that matter. I think this is both unrealistic and undesirable. As I said earlier, little opium here and now may still be necessary. However, I think we need, so to speak, more of Sam Harris and less of Jordan Peterson in a sense of a more open and direct confrontation of religion in its various forms. As I also said earlier in other videos, I think civil religion in the West is clearly somehow post-Christian, and it comes in two different major forms. On the one hand, the more still religious, partly Christian populism on the right, represented politically by people like Trump and the Republican Party in the US, and then intellectually by people like Jordan Peterson. And then on the left wing of today's civil religion in the West, which is equally rooted in Christianity, is much more secular. It has, so to speak, followed Feuerbach's secularization path and takes on the shape today of what is often called wokeism. I want to suggest that basically the metaphor of religion as the people's opium is still valid today, but it needs a little bit of a twist. I want to talk about religion as the cocaine of the people of today. So what is religion, or what is civil religion? First, I think it's some form of dogmatic, non-negotiable master narrative that frames some sort of moralistic worldview. Then, importantly, it's strongly emotionally charged. It channels affection. It channels emotions like love and hate. It establishes us and them distinctions, right? And you see this both in Christian religion, but also, as I said, like in populism or in wokeism as civil religious post-Christian phenomena. Then it's publicly displayed and celebrated in speech, in certain symbols, and specifically in ritualistic behavior, right? Traditionally, we have the Christian rituals and the Christian symbols. And today we have something like virtue signaling, or in the case of the conservatives, like jingoism and nationalism. Then it is also both civil religion and religion are used to adorn economic and political actions, right? Christianity was used to legitimize and adorn imperialism, right? The boats that brought the opium to China would also bring weapons and Bibles. Similar, as we showed in other videos, civil religion today is used to adorn not only capitalist corporations and their woke branding, but also even the CIA. Then it is emphasized in education. Traditionally in Europe, schools and other educational institutions were run by the church. And today there's a very strong source, for instance, of wokeism in educational institutions. It has to be added, in Christianity we have different schisms later on, importantly the schism between Protestantism and Catholicism. In Islam we have the schism between Shia and Sunni, and as mentioned in contemporary civil religion we have this schism between more left-wing wokeism and more right-wing populism. Perhaps the shortest definition what religion and civil religion is that what you're not supposed to make fun of. I think, like Christianity in the past, civil religion today also produces false relief from suffering, right? It reassures society of its values, right? Defense of individual autonomy, democracy, but at the same time it distracts from economic issues, poverty, joblessness, a critique of the commodification of everything. It seems less important than these moralist messages. So somehow it sustains a capitalist economy by focusing on moral rather than socioeconomic problems. Then secondly, there is an aspect of intolerance and aggression attached to it. Civil religious narratives very strongly frame both internal and external them versus us conflicts, right? Wokeism and populism fight one another on the one hand, but then externally they join in some form of new Cold War nowadays, for instance, against China, which is seen as a threat to certain core Western values that unite the wokeism people and the populist people, again, having to do with something like individual autonomy and democracy. So it seems now that some form of new opium war might become possible, which again will be fought in the name not of Christian values and not of the Christian master narrative, but in the name of the post-Christian civil religious narrative. Then civil religion, like traditional religion, provides some form of ecstasy, some form of highs. Like cocaine, it makes people feel good about themselves, gives them the moral high ground. Right? You see this in virtue signaling, but you see it also in Trumpism, whatever, in the Capitol riots, where people feel a strong sense of entitlement and feel very good about them. So civil religion today, as the people's cocaine, also attaches itself, like traditional religion, to every aspect of life. At least it can do so, right? The media today, for instance, no longer simply report. They spice everything up with religious framing, right? Depending on which media. If you watch CNN, you have tendentially a wokeist framing. If you watch Fox, you have tendentially a rightist populist framing of basically everything and anything. Then how individuals express themselves through, for instance, memes, also is very strongly indicative of certain civil religious persuasions. Then, of course, it also determines who you hang out socially with, right? It determines, in this sense, your social life. Then it determines often the brand choices you make. Some certain brands are more woke and other brands are more traditional. Then, very importantly, sexuality and gender are also highly charged, just as it was the case in traditional religion. Now they're highly charged with civil religious meaning, right? How you practice your sexuality and how you see your gender almost becomes a form of revelation and display of your civil religious faith. So again, civil religion, like traditional religion, can turn people into possessed and obsessed addicts. Doesn't necessarily do so, but it can do so. And importantly, it defines people's identity. It lends itself, not always, but sometimes, to obsessive self-profiling, right? You identify yourself and others in terms of civil religion. It becomes a major profile marker that is hard to avoid. It's difficult to evade, right? It's difficult to find any neutral ground. And thereby, the civil religious framework is increasingly internalized by users. It gives a strong boost of the sense of selfhood and of your experience of your selfhood. There's a strong investment in it. So in this sense, I like the metaphor of cocaine better than the metaphor of opium when it comes to civil religion rather than to traditional religion, because it very strongly boosts the perception of individual identity. As we saw with Marx, traditional religion, Christianity, was still somehow tied to sincerity-based enactment and identification with roles, specifically family roles. However, in civil religion, there's a much stronger emphasis on the individual and the shaping of an individual's profile rather than the shaping of traditional role identities. And cocaine, too, as a drug of choice today, where opium isn't that widely consumed anymore, also, I think, highlights a kind of narcissistic individual self-display. So what to do about civil religion? Inspired by both Marx and Zen Buddhism, I think it's important to acknowledge and understand its function. It's also very important to critique it publicly. Then it's important to develop a capacity to resist and also subvert it. And finally, as for cocaine and alcohol, for civil religion, especially on Christmas, the advice is consume responsibly.